Good afternoon. This is John Bushka. I want to continue with the narrative of my life in Dallas as part of the chapter coverage of the chapter 3 of my U.S. Hotel book. It's picking up in 1981. I did leave the combined employment at the combined A and B consortium, the Medicare consortium, as the project was falling apart. It was a difficult time in my life after the previous year had been so interesting with the travel. Because of a referral, I got a job pretty easily at Chilton Corporation, which is a credit reporting company. It eventually would go to be sold to TRW in the late 80s, and eventually that would turn out to be Experian today, which is now 20 miles north of Dallas. But at the time, it was in the Oak Lawn area on Fitzhugh Avenue. It was very convenient. And in 1982, life kind of continued as it had. I traveled particularly to Toronto one time, and then I went to England in November, played the chess tournaments and so forth. Late in the year, I started hearing more stories about a new disease, AIDS, and I had contemplated this before in the late 70s and something like this could happen. But I thought it was something that some people would get and most people would get over. And there was actually a conference in Dallas in late 1982, and I met James Coran, and I think it went from being called GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency, to AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. But I didn't really. That was in late 1982. And I'll also mention, that in early 1982 was probably when I first really heard it mentioned specifically again. I went to see Making Love at a theater in North Park. That was a very famous film. And there was some copies of This Week in Texas, a gay magazine called Twit. And there was a story about people having Kaposi sarcoma in New York City and San Francisco and Los Angeles, and the concern. So actually, throughout 1982, there was a low-level concern in Dallas, and a couple of meetings at MCC with in the conference at the end of 1982. And then in 1983, the heat started building up more, or the concern started building up more, particularly by March and April, when Time magazine had a story, the public health threat of the century. There were various theories around, like prions, and there was another virus that turned out to be the wrong one, a retrovirus in Japan that actually caused a T-cell cancer. It was HTLV1. But that didn't turn out to be right. That didn't go anywhere. But in the meantime, we didn't know exactly what was causing it. And by 1980, say May, there were severe political concerns about it. And there was a proposed enhancement of the Texas sodomy law, which had been 2106, to make it 2138. Which would have banned gay men or gay people in general from many occupations involving meeting the public, including preparing and serving food and working in hospitals and teachers and all kinds of things, because it was a fear of some kind of contagion that we didn't know about. It had been introduced by Bill Severha in Amarillo. And then there was a very strong lobbying effort by the Dallas Gay Alliance to knock it down. I even remember the Texas House Committee was run by Wayne DeVito. I still remember the names. And they succeeded in stopping it from leaving committee by a vote of 7-2. But so that was a scare. In the summer of 1983, I started getting concerned myself. One day I noticed a lesion on my trunk as I was in the shower. And so I went to the doctor, and he didn't actually know. And he took out a couple of moles, and he took out the lesion. And for a weekend, I was wondering, could it be KS? And that was actually right after, it was July the 15th. It was right after my 40th birthday. And it turned out it was nothing. It was just non-specific inflammation. So then I sort of had a breather, but we were constantly looking for, at our bodies all the time for about 6 months until we got used to this. I was more worried about KS than I was PCP, because PCP would really be sick, but KS you weren't necessarily at first. It could come on gradually. But there would also be that sensational story with Rivera, on Geraldo Rivera on 2020 on ABC that showed that patient with advanced KS. I remember that. There was also a group in Dallas called the Dallas Doctors Against AIDS, which tried to lobby against gay men, tried to lobby for laws, isolating gay men from the rest of the public and so forth. I actually wrote a letter to one of them, which later I met with Bill Nelson about at DGA. He was angry that I would even talk to them, but I actually wrote a letter and got back a letter. They were very concerned, and they had said this with 2130 in the language of 2138. They had said that gay men went to collectively engage in a chain letter of transmission because men could transmit the disease from and to each other. That if the virus ever mutated, it could then threaten the general population. Of course, if it did, it would probably change character. And you could also make the other argument that people were immunosuppressed, they could incubate other diseases. That was an indirect threat. And we've heard about that more recently with COVID, with the various variants and speculation like that with COVID and immunosuppression. But in fact, that never really happened. People who were HIV positive would get TB, advanced forms of TB and other kinds of things, but that never really happened, that it incubated a secondary disease that threatened other people. And the idea, even though the virus mutated a lot, it never actually changed the way it was transmission. So that turned out to be a red herring. But the idea, we've heard that idea with other diseases since then, like Zika virus, and with babies being born with deformed heads. An important point to remember also was that in Africa, AIDS was being spread about equally by heterosexual contact as well as gay contact, probably because of women in underdeveloped countries were likely to more have sexually transmitted diseases and lesions and so forth that made transmission more likely in both directions. Whereas in Western countries, that was less true. But this was a very scary time that the baths were closed in San Francisco in 1984. I remember that, and I had visited on it in 1975. And the rhetoric was teaming up, but the discovery of the virus, HELV3 rather than HELV1, which was renamed HIV, was announced. And then I took the test myself in 1985 and it was negative, and then I knew to be careful. So I had escaped, but I became sort of a buddy working with the Oakland Counseling Center. I wasn't as committed to it as some other people were. Just constantly with their pain, their buddies all the time and taking care of them, giving up their jobs and everything. Oh, I'll also mention, I didn't mention in the last video that there was a push in early 1980 to get gay men to host gay people from Cuba, from the Mirabella boat lift. And I actually looked at that. I actually went and talked to Catholic Charities on Lemon Avenue, and they rejected me because I was gay. And I talked to another gay church, a smaller one, and if you were going to sponsor somebody, you had to give up your job and be with them all the time. So I couldn't really do that. That's when I later in the year took on a homeless person that I met at MCC who lived with me for 3 months. I kind of thought it was my duty, but I had forgotten to mention the refugee issue, the Cuban refugee issue, which had happened in 1980 before AIDS was an issue in the video yesterday. The so as I did have an attachment to one particular patient who had overcome Kaposi sarcoma and recovered completely and was very healthy and was voluntary. But then he started to get sick again in 1987, and he eventually passed away. And I eventually found his quilt in 1988 in the AIDS quilt in Washington D.C. I think it was 88, but it's somebody I might have dated. And there were a couple of the best dates I ever had in my life happened in 1980. One of them kind of was a one-day stand, not just a one-night stand, where we went to church the next day. That's something else I didn't mention. But this is somebody I could have been with that person, and I wasn't, and I never got infected. But and one of the things also is you can compare. Of course, you can compare AIDS with COVID, which was 180 degrees the opposite. COVID was very transmissible casually, and gay men tend, at least particularly anecdotally, whom I know, tended to do very well in not getting COVID during the pandemic in 2020, partly because they lived in smaller households, and partly the well-educated gay men that knew the lessons from 30 years before about public health. And also, it turned out that if you had HIV, if you took the protease inhibitors, they seemed to protect you. It seemed like they were protecting people from getting COVID, and maybe even PrEP was a little bit effective. But the people I knew anecdotally, almost no one got very sick, or a lot of people never even tested positive. And so gay men might have been almost the safest group during the COVID pandemic 3 decades later. And that's a bit of an irony, but that's covered some other time. In 1987, also the project that nature in the workplace kind of changed. I got a lot busier, and I think I explained that in another video about the workplace. On New Year's Day of 1986, I put something into production, and my father had just passed away that night, and then I flew home for his funeral the next day. But I actually worked that day in production support on a holiday when my father had passed away. That was one thing, and gay people often then didn't have families and often were more likely to work more of the overtime, production support and overtime and so forth, and not really be paid for it because they could. And that's something I've talked about before. I just wanted to share just one or two little pictures and I'll just I just wanted to share the cathedral, a picture of the Cathedral of Hope, which was a large church, an evangelical church started in the gay community. It's now part of the United Churches of Christ, I think. And I think it's on Inwood, just on the other side of Lemon Avenue, near Oak Lawn, near Love Field also. And I'll also share, I bought a condo at the beginning of 1985. And that's what it looked like. I was in this unit, and there was 3.5, I was in it for 3.5 years. When I left and went back to Washington, D.C., after Chilton got bought by TRW, and I was confronted with the question, should I stay to the end and not be confident I wouldn't be laid off. I actually probably could have, but that presented an interesting question, which I think I'll take up in the next video because it's kind of a different topic. So, again, I do thank you for listening. This is a very important episode, just to remember to keep the history of these public health issues in perspective, that AIDS was so different from COVID, yet we have a lot to learn from both epidemics, and what we learned from AIDS, particularly protease inhibitors and so forth, which made things much more manageable in the 90s. It didn't take long to really turn this around and make it something so that people no longer needed to die of it. Whereas, in the first few years, the cases were doubling every 6 months, and it was nearly always fatal. But by the early 90s, that was changing, with AZT and some of the other things. So I do thank you for listening.